Hello there, welcome to Planet America's Fireside Chat. I'm John Barrett.
And I'm Jason Cisello.
This week, Donald Trump is courting the black vote. We'll find out whether he stands much of a chance.
I'm going to be looking at why computer chips have become a crucial part of America's national security plans. But first...
And first this week, to the fallout from the Hunter Biden trial. The president's son was convicted this week of 3 federal crimes relating to his purchase of a gun while he was addicted to crack cocaine in 2018. Hunter Biden made a false statement on the official form that gun buyers have to fill out. He declared that he was not using illegal drugs. He was, and he now faces up to 25 years in prison. His lawyers have vowed to appeal. It could even go all the way to the United States Supreme Court as a Second Amendment gun rights case. So, in the space of a week and a half, we have seen both a former US president and the current president's son criminally convicted. Neither of those things has ever happened before. Democrats have been keen to point out the perceived hypocrisy of Republicans over the 2 cases, but Speaker Mike Johnson sees some pretty important differences between the Trump and Hunter Biden trial.
And the evidence was overwhelming here. I don't think that's the case in the Trump trials, and all the charges that have been brought against him have been obviously brought for political purposes.
And what if one of President Trump's children were prosecuted by the U.S. Department of Justice? The entire Republican Party would be in an uproar, demanding that everybody be fired and that the investigation be quashed.
Unlike Donald Trump, President Biden says he accepts the jury's verdict, and he also says he will not pardon his son. But as our guest on Planet America this week, Anush Kadori, told us, that does leave open the option of Biden commuting Hunter Biden's sentence without an official pardon, or indeed just waiting until after the election when, particularly if he's lost the election, he got nothing to lose. He'll probably pardon his son, particularly if he's sentenced to many years in jail.
Yeah, someone should get Biden on the record about the commuting question pretty quick.
Might be question number 1 in the debate in a couple of weeks, I think.
I suspect so. Look, the Republicans are in a weird position because we talked about this on the show on Wednesday, that they were running the line before the verdict that actually the Bidens were inappropriately trying to rig the trial in Hunter Biden's favour.
So he'd get off.
Yeah, exactly. Like that Jill Biden was staring them down like a mafioso, the jury, and Joe Biden was meeting with Haley Biden as a witness beforehand to sort out their testimony, and it was all dodgy and seamy, and then suddenly they're left out on a rock, like a shag on a rock, because it's a guilty verdict.
Yeah.
So how do they harmonise this cognitive dissonance in their mind? I've seen 2 different ways the Republicans have tried to do this. First of all is the line that actually this was the plan all along to get Hunter Biden to end up guilty to make Trump's conviction look like it wasn't rigged.
So Hunter Biden was convicted. Big freaking deal. This trial was a sham. Just like the Trump trial, it was a sham, but a sham for a different reason. It's a sham designed to legitimize the Trump conviction. That's why it came right after, even for charges that date way far back.
So this is the plan all along. They got a Republican judge to somehow to decide that Hunter's trial would be right after Donald Trump's trial, and Joe Biden is sacrificing his own son to potential jail time just so they can win the spin cycle a little bit. I mean, is this as insane as it sounds like to me?
Completely. It's the quicksilver of conspiracy theories that immediately morph as soon as the reality changes. So to say this is being rigged so he's going to get off, he gets off. Well, it's being rigged again because there is another reason for him now to be found guilty because of some other nefarious reason. I think it's important to point out a couple of things are quite, I think, evident now after this case. It didn't take long to find him guilty. 3 hours was the deliberation after a 1-week trial. He was guilty.
Yeah.
There was no doubt.
Guilty.
He was found guilty. But the other thing that is also true, a lot of experts are saying, this case would never have gone to trial had he not been the president's son. The political pressure from congressional Republicans on the special counsel and the judge who reviewed it and then sort of said this plea deal is falling apart. But the fact that this went to trial at all and that there is still pressure to have a fairly significant sentence, that's problematic.
Well, this leads us to the second kind of spin, which is that, once again, this was the plan all along to distract from, with Hunter Biden being the scapegoat, to distract from the real crimes. This was the Trump campaign's take. I'll just read this out for you. This trial has been nothing more than a distraction from the real crimes of the Biden crime family, which has raked in tens of millions of dollars from China, Russia and Ukraine. Crooked Joe Biden's reign over the Biden family criminal empire is all coming to an end on November 5th. Never again will a Biden sell government access for personal profit. As for Hunter, we wish him well in his recovery and legal affairs. Which is a nice little ending, I thought. Yeah. Except then they re-sent out that statement and removed the last line.
Yeah, right.
Because obviously it was a little too nice for the boss. So anyway, so that's the second kind of spin. And to that, what I would say to that is I would say, well, if you think you've got the Joe Biden on these amazing crimes, impeach him. Yeah. What are you waiting for? We keep on hearing about this, about these amazing crimes that Joe Biden should be impeached for. Well, do it. You've got the House. Yeah, I mean, this is the same thing that some Republicans have firmly believed since 2019, that Joe Biden is the head of the Biden crime family and that he's the big guy who's taking all of the money from Burisma and, you know, all this kind of, like, this conspiracy theory is still pretty big. If you buy into it, though, you're a Trump voter. This I don't know changes a single mind. I don't think that Hunter Biden's conviction, given that most American families have dealt with somebody who has been addicted to drugs, has broken the law. It's important to know that in this case, he broke the law, he got the gun, he had it for 11 days, it was never loaded, it was tossed in a garbage bin at a supermarket. Not a great thing to do, but this was the level of desperation of Hunter Biden and some of the people that were around him while he was deep in this addiction. Usually these cases are only prosecuted when the gun that there was a false statement made to purchase is then used for a crime and it becomes a secondary charge because somebody holds up a bank with it. There was no bank hold up with this gun. The gun was never used, he owned it for 11 days, but he lied on that form and he deserves to be punished. There's no doubt about it. Either way, he didn't pay his taxes, so it gets worse next trial. Yeah, and people will believe that, there'll be something in those tax details that talk about Joe Biden and all the money he's getting from Ukraine. So this thing doesn't end here. Meanwhile, speaking of crazy conspiracy theories, Steve Bannon, the president's former White House chief strategist, has been ordered to begin serving a 4-month prison sentence on July the 1st for defying a subpoena from the Congressional January 6th committee. Steve Bannon is continuing to try and appeal this decision by US District Court Judge Carl Nichols, who, by the way, was appointed by Donald Trump. Bannon saying that we're going to go all the way to the Supreme Court if we have to. There's not a prison built or a jail built that will shut me up. And on that, I think he's probably telling the absolute truth, Chaz. No doubt about it. We should remind people what this is all about, though. The January 6th committee had good reason to want to talk to Steve Bannon.
The committee has learned from the White House phone logs that the president spoke to Steve Bannon, his close advisor, at least twice on January 5th. The first conversation they had lasted for 11 minutes. Listen to what Mr. Bannon said that day after the first call he had with the president.
All hell is going to break loose tomorrow. It's all converging, and now we're on, as they say, the point of attack, right? The point of attack tomorrow. I'll tell you this. It's not going to happen like you think it's going to happen, okay? It's going to be quite extraordinarily different. And all I can say is strap in. So I can see why they were interested in his testimony. But Bannon claimed he couldn't testify because he was covered by Trump's executive privilege claims. That's when it's in the national interest for presidents to be able to deliberate on matters of state with their closest advisors. That's all fair enough, except Bannon wasn't actually a government official on January 6th. He hadn't been one since Trump fired him 4 years earlier in 2017. Also, the January 6th committee wanted to talk to him about more than his communications with Trump, and he wouldn't talk to them about anything or give them documents. So it was a pretty lame excuse from Bannon. I do want to cover one more thing, though. We're now hearing tweets, or seeing tweets from people like Charlie Kirk saying things like, this will go all the way up to the election. Direct election interference, because he's covering the last 4 months before the election. Now, he wasn't meant to go to jail in the last 4 months before the election. He was meant to go to jail in October last year. He's been the one kicking the can. He's exhausted every last appeal and he's still trying. And that's fair enough. But you can't then complain that, it's all rigged. This is all designed to last the last 4 months of the election interference. No, this is down to Bannon. But my question to you is this. He's not the only person who's committed contempt of Congress. Merrick Garland was cited
by Congress of contempt of Congress yesterday.
Yep.
And in his case, it was because he wasn't releasing the recordings of Joe Biden's interview with the special counsel, the one where he had the poor memory. He released the transcript, but he wouldn't release the audio. He said because he didn't want to discourage people from being recorded by Department of Justice in the future, because he knew it was going to be used as an attack ad, essentially. Well, the House said, no, that's not good enough. They cited him for contempt. He's not going to go to jail because he's the one who decides who is prosecuted for contempt of Congress. But is there a massive double standard here that the Democrat official could do whatever the hell he liked? Steve Bannon he spurns a committee, he's going to jail.
I think it's an apples and oranges kind of a situation, because Merrick Garland was not refusing to appear before Congress to give any evidence. He appears before Congress to give evidence all the time, as do senior administration officials. There's a part of the accountability and the oversight of Congress. That's what it's there for. So that's fine. That he said, well, the audio tape is not going to be released. You've got the transcript. You've got the evidence. What do you need the audio tape for? Well, yes, he knows that it's for political purposes. It's so that Joe Biden sounds old and faltering in that interview where the special counsel, Robert Hur, said that he sounded like a sort of a dithery old fart. Well, I think that was the quote. That was the exact quote. Let's just say it was the exact quote. It wasn't. But so I think there's a key difference there. That being said, though, I'm very uncomfortable with the idea of Congress having the power to send anybody to jail by holding them in contempt. Congress, and the same with impeachment. I mean, if you've got this purely political body pretending to be a court and having partisans who are abusing the powers of Congress, 20, 30 years ago, Congress didn't tend to hold people in contempt of Congress. They didn't need to, because people answered subpoenas because they knew when they came to Congress they'd actually get a fair hearing. Now people are thinking twice about giving evidence before Congress because you have buffoons like Marjorie Taylor Greene there grandstanding. You look at poor Anthony Fauci last week. I mean, why would you subject yourself to dingbats like that? So I can see why people don't want to go. If you don't have the threat of being held in contempt to answer a subpoena from Congress, people won't come, but then you're handing them the power to send people to jail for being in contempt. It's a ridiculous situation, which is all down to the kind of, the whack jobs that are getting elected these days and the hyper-partisanship of Congress. The system is broken, but I don't think the fix is to have those politicians saying, OK, we're going to send the Attorney General to jail, or indeed Steve Bannon to jail. He should front up, he should give the evidence, and if he is going to be held in contempt, there should be a fuller judicial process, not simply a test of does he have privilege or not?
Well, the first point I would make to that is that Bannon has had the fullest judicial process anyone possibly could. Yeah. He's been going for years and years. This was back in 2021. He's had 3 years of judicial process, so it's not like they just threw him in jail straight away. I agree with you about the apples and oranges thing with Merrick Garland, in that Merrick Garland he gave them a transcript. He was cooperating, right? Whereas Steve Bannon's case was zero cooperation. What a lot of people don't remember is that Dan Scavino and Mark Meadows also didn't testify to the January 6th Commission, and they were not prosecuted for contempt because they did participate as much as they could short of an executive privilege claim. So even though the executive privilege claim wasn't necessarily respected, they weren't jailed for using the executive privilege claim because they cooperated otherwise. Whereas Bannon gave them donuts. And so that was actually a different situation, and a different situation in Merrick Garland. Now, to the question of whether they should ever be jailed from Congress, it's an interesting question. It's odd for you to take the more bolshy position than me on this. I'm the guy who
I've had a week off.
That's right. I feel like there is a proper judicial process here. They do need to go to court. It's a court that decides it, not Congress. Congress can cite whoever they like. It comes down to the court. But I understand you being uneasy about just ramping it up and just threatening people with jail all of a sudden. I don't love it, but I think if you don't have it, then if you don't have at least the threat of jail, then, as you're saying, now people are starting to not turn up. There'll be more and more people not turning up. And I understand it's because they're dingbats, but they're congressional dingbats.
They're
and
duly
they should be
elected
respected.
dingbats.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, I wouldn't want to rule out jail time, but I do agree. I'm a little uneasy, even though I don't think it's a double standard.
And to tie it back to the Hunter Biden case, I think it's a terrible precedent that any family member of a president or former president should be prosecuted in such a way that is a result of a political process. And there's clearly political pressure in this case. This is about trying to get at President Biden, and if there are criminal matters relating to politicians' families, it should be completely excluded from the political sphere. I know that's not realistic, but it just shouldn't be an issue. Yes, there should be accountability, but there should not be politicisation of a private citizen who happens to share the last name with a president or former president. Same goes for Eric Trump or Don Jr. or Ivanka or Jared or whoever. They should not be prosecuted because of political pressure, only because of what they might have done wrong.
Yep.
Now, while we're on legal matters, a pretty significant ruling came down for the United States Supreme Court earlier today. And with more, here's Tom Butler of Fox 9 Morning News at 11 out of Minneapolis St. Paul.
It has preserved access to a medication used in most abortions. In a unanimous ruling, the justices have ruled that abortion opponents lack the legal standing to sue over the FDA's approval of mifepristone.
Mifepristone is now the drug that is used most to induce abortions in the United States. About 2/3 of terminations are with that one drug. But efforts to ban it or ban it being sent via the mail into states that have all but outlawed abortion do continue on a number of legal fronts despite this ruling. This was essentially kind of a technical win for those that want this drug to still be available because the people that brought the case were found to have no standing in it. Tell us a bit about where this came from in the Texas court system.
Yeah, look, this is an example of something that's a huge problem in America at the moment, which is people court shopping, essentially, picking the most either liberal or conservative judge they possibly can to try and get something all the way to the Supreme Court, and hopefully, and in this case it's more about conservatives than liberals because the Supreme Court is conservative, and they hope they can get an extremely conservative ruling in front of the Supreme Court and then leverage the fact that 6-3 conservatives on the Supreme Court. This is not new, it's been going on for a while, but right now it's pretty chronic, in particular in the Fifth Circuit, which is the Texas circuit of the court system, which is the most conservative circuit. There is one little district in Amarillo, North Texas, with a guy called Kaczmarek, who's a district judge. He's like 40. He's really young. Really is a Trump appointee.
Very conservative.
Yeah, very conservative, and he's essentially he pushes the law to the point where it's almost nutcasery. He really does go very, very far with what he allows. Everyone knows it. So they all file in his district in the hope that they can get to the Supreme Court. And this is what happened here. The standing call was a really easy call. Like, the district court judge should not have let this go through. He let it go through because he's super conservative and he just wants to nail abortion and pills as much as he possibly can. It got through the Fifth Circuit because they are also extremely conservative. And then it got to the Supreme Court and wasted everyone's time. And they thought they'd have a chance because the Supreme Court. I'm glad the Supreme Court slapped it down 9-0. Hopefully with a few more of these slap downs, there'll be less of this kind of stuff. But in the meantime, there's like 4 other cases involving this guy that are equally dubious, and we just have to put up with them for now.
Yeah, but of course it does mean that while ever this is happening, and we had yesterday Senate Republicans blocking a bill that would have protected the right to access IVF treatments, these cases and these bills that are coming forward from both sides are just going to keep this issue bubbling along. In the meantime, close to 200,000 women had to travel interstate last year in order to get a termination because it is now illegal in their home state. And that's putting a massive burden on the health systems and the budgets of other states and other people. For decades and decades, certainly from the American Civil War onwards, African American voters have tended to support the Republican Party. That was really from the time of Abraham Lincoln, who obviously opposed slavery, rather than the Democrats who had fought to preserve slavery. It took a long time for that to begin to change. It wasn't until the 1930s and the Great Depression, under the presidency of Democrat Franklin Roosevelt, who initiated programs that kept many Americans, including a lot of African Americans, off the breadline, that suddenly Democrats started to appeal for the first time in a long time to African Americans. And then through the civil rights era of the 1950s and 1960s, when it was Democrats who were much more progressive, losing their conservative southern base, we saw them getting to the point now where in 2016, Chaz, Hillary Clinton got 91% of black votes. Donald Trump just got 6% of black votes in 2016. 4 years ago, Joe Biden performed even better than Hillary Clinton. He got 92%, although Trump also inched up a little bit to 8% because of a lower third-party vote that year. But then this year, well, it's looking like something else could be happening. According to Pew Research, at least, currently just 77% of black voters plan to vote for Joe Biden, or are leaning that way. 18% say that they're going to vote for Donald Trump, or are leaning that way. Now, around 36 million Americans, African Americans, are eligible to vote. That's about 14% of the overall voting population. This is very significant. And if those polls are right, and those kinds of numbers, they could doom Joe Biden to defeat this November. And Donald Trump is clearly aware of this. He thinks that he can make inroads. He's making quite a play for black voters at the moment. He did so in the primaries, you might have noticed. Now in the general election phase, he's saying things like his criminal indictments and even the mugshot appeals to black voters because what's happened to him has happened to them. Trump held a rally last month in the traditionally black neighbourhood of the South Bronx in New York City, and he surrounded himself with a lot of supporters, African Americans and Latino Americans. Amongst them were those gangster rappers who are facing murder charges. But Trump's pitch to black and brown voters is very much to appeal to patriotism over race.
It doesn't matter whether you're black or brown or white or whatever the hell color you are, it doesn't matter. We are all Americans, and we're going to pull together as Americans.
And we can possibly break this down even further, John, because even though Trump received 8% from black voters overall in 2020, he received 12% of votes from black men in 2020. And wait for it, there are some polls like a recent Wall Street Journal poll that have as many as 30% of black men saying they'll either definitely or probably vote for Trump. So that might be why he's trying to appeal to black men right now. Also, black young voters, because even though older black voters are identifying as Democrats over Republicans by a whopping 82%, that's the right of the graph there. On the left of the graph, you can see young black voters who don't have a memory of the civil rights era are favouring Democrats by only 33%. Now, those are just a few polls. They might be garbage. So shall we speak to an expert?
Let's do exactly that. For more, we are joined by Joshua Doss. He's a pollster and expert in black voting behaviour. He started off as a grassroots organiser in Chicago. He's worked for congressional Democrats, political action committees. He worked on the presidential campaign of now Vice President Kamala Harris. Now he's with the political consultancy firm Hit Strategies. Josh Doss, welcome to the Fireside Chat.
Yeah, great to be here. I'm glad you all reached out.
Josh, in recent elections, anywhere from sort of 5 to 10% of black voters have supported Republicans. Polls now, at least some of them, suggest that Trump could be attracting as much as twice that. So what do you think is going on?
I don't believe that black voters are very warm towards Trump. The research that we've been conducting at Hit Strategies among black voters is not showing that attraction towards Trump. I just led a poll where we had a robust sample size of black voters. It was over 1,300. With a sub 3% margin of error, with some oversamples. So a very strong poll. And Donald Trump is still hanging out around that 12 to 9% support among black voters. And black voters seem to have the same affinity for the Republican Party that they've always had. I'm not sure where these other polls, I think a lot of these other polls don't have a robust sample size of black voters. And they're analyzing black voters within a sample size that is actually a nationally representative sample size, where the margin of error increases when you try to segment by black voters. So I just haven't seen that movement in our research. And I think other groups like Cornell Belcher at Brilliant Corners that do robust sample sizes of black voters haven't seen that movement either.
Josh, there's been speculation that a generation gap has opened up amongst black voters, where the young voters who have no memory of the civil rights era are more Republican curious. Have you seen any evidence of that in your research?
I wouldn't. First of all, you're absolutely right in the generation gap. I'd say it all the time. Gen Z voters vote like Gen Z. Gen Z voters look at issues like Gen Z, right? I wouldn't call them more curious towards the Republican Party, but they're a lot more critical of the Democratic Party. They've been critical of Biden's handling of Gaza. They've been critical about large economic aspirations that traditional Democrats have had. They've been critical about the Democratic Party's love affair with corporate interests, right? And so you're just seeing them not so much curious about whether or not, particularly Black Gen Z voters, not so much curious about what's on the other side of the aisle, but just more so frustrated with what they've been given. And I think that when we talk about the upcoming election, that is actually the biggest danger, is that not that they end up voting for Republicans, but a lot of them might end up not voting at all. We've said multiple times, there's three major candidates in this upcoming election: Donald Trump, Joe Biden, and the couch. And the couch is looking better and better as we as we kind of go along to some of these Gen Z voters who are upset with the Democratic Party.
So, Josh, if younger black voters are drifting away from the traditional allegiance to the Democratic Party, what do you think is driving that? Is it a matter of policy differences, or is it something as simple as you don't get much older or whiter than President Joe Biden?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think they've communicated just very strong policy differences with the Democratic Party at large. To be fair, I guess, to Joe Biden, they're much more critical of how Obama led the country from a foreign policy standpoint and from an economic policy standpoint domestically as well. And so I think the policy concerns are very much so there for the younger voters. And the age concerns, I believe, are there for all. I saw a poll that said somewhere around 60% of Americans are pretty concerned about President Biden's age. So I wouldn't even say that is specific to young black voters or black voters at all. I think that there's a lot of Americans that are worried about that.
Now, every election we see polls suggesting that black voters might be leaking away from the Democrats or staying home. And lo and behold, election time, the black voters have returned to the Democrats. Now, is that sense of ebb and flow of black voters real, or were those black voters never in doubt in those previous elections?
Yeah, it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier. I mean, it reminds me also of every election we hear about a wave. It might be a red wave or a blue wave. We heard about the red wave in the midterms that didn't happen. I think, in all honesty, what ends up happening is some folks looking to make headlines, either don't conduct public opinion in ways that should be reported upon, or we're just seeing just a little bit of that searching for other options when we're far away from the election time. But I think when we get closer to election time and we get in paid communication cycles, right? We get in those couple 3-4 months before the election where the party is going to put forward its best communicators. Black voters oftentimes realize that there isn't much for them on the right side of the aisle.
What do you make of former President Trump's attempted outreach to black voters, Josh? We've seen it for a number of months now with those rallies in South Bronx. He's also talked about maybe African-American Senator Tim Scott as his vice presidential running mate. He's certainly a key surrogate. Could he, as VP, make a difference when it comes to Trump's appeal to black voters?
I struggle believing that it will add that adding Tim Scott to the ticket will add to Trump's appeal. One, black Republicans are categorically unpopular among black people, and oftentimes they are not elected by black people. Tim Scott joins a long line of black Republicans who often win elections by garnering a massive amount of support from white voters who are very ideologically misaligned with their black neighbors. So there's like an electoral and oftentimes cultural separation that hurts black Republicans' favorabilities. I can only imagine that that's true for Tim Scott as well. Secondly, Trump's coalition harbors some of the most measurably racist voters in America. Whether or not Trump is racist is an argument that folks can volley back and forth until the day ends. But what almost can't be argued is that racists think that he's racist. I remember doing work in 2016 around the presidential election, and I saw a stat that showed the counties that hosted a Trump rally saw like a 200% increase in hate crimes, right? So maybe that might not be 51% or more of Trump's voters, but I believe it's enough to piss off a portion of his base that he needs to win an election. And I think people can say anything that they want about Trump, but the man knows his base, and he knows the deep racial tensions that he stokes through his rhetoric. And I just don't believe that elevating a black man to that level of status could be beneficial for his base.
Now, Josh, I've read a number of quotes and news reports about how black voters feel like they're being taken for granted by Democrats. Do you think that's true? Because it seems from my perspective that Democrats are acutely conscious of appealing to black voters.
Yeah, I might stay away from the question of do I think it's true, because I'm a pollster and I get to read public opinion at a nationally representative level, and I can tell you that 57% of black women voters, we found out from a poll, believe that their vote is being taken for granted, including 73% of black Gen Z women that believe that their vote is being taken for granted. So that's a massive percentage. So look, I think that it can be certainly said that the Democratic Party, I have seen the efforts that they have made to not only be attuned to the priorities of black voters. Some of it is not, it's not landed, and they need to find a way to connect the intent with the actual results of making black and brown voters, for that matter, feel like their vote is not being taken advantage of.
Joshua Doss, thanks for your time this week. We appreciate you having a fireside chat.
Thanks, y'all. Appreciate you.
Now to a couple of potentially critical indicators in this election. Firstly, inflation is effectively zero in May. You can see here headline inflation is now down to 3.3% over the last year, and core inflation, that's inflation minus food and energy, is down to 3.4%. That's the lowest it's been since April 2021. Another couple of months, those two lines will be in the twos, and then the Reserve Bank will have the excuse they might be looking for to reduce interest rates. But John, is that too little too late?
Well, certainly the problem that they've got right now is that even though inflation is moderated, interest rates are still high. The Reserve Bank this week said they've amended their forecast to say we were expecting 3 rate cuts this year. We're now expecting 1. So that means things are only going to get cheaper on one occasion by maybe 25 basis points between now and November. So that's not good news because, as we know, prices are not coming down. They're just not going up by just as much. So the kind of the sense that things are too expensive, it's baked in. How Biden addresses this, Trump is already offering tax cuts. That puts money back into people's pockets, at least they think, if they don't look at the fine details. So this is going to be an interesting challenge for Biden. The economy is going pretty well, but they're not getting that message across, and the lived experience is still pushing back against it because inflation did go high, it's now moderating, interest rates are still high, so life is expensive. Yeah,
I'd say 2 things. Number 1, our rule of thumb we've talked about for many years now is it takes about 6 months for people to notice a change in the economy. We're 5 months from the election now. This is the second month in a row where inflation's been basically zero. They're not going to want one of those percolations that we've seen over the last 6 months or so where it looks okay and then bang, a little inflation jump and then back to zero again. One more of them and he's done as far as inflation goes because he needs zero from here on in, I think, for it to get through to people at all. The second thing I'd say is, like you say, there's an expectation of one more interest rate rise. If that interest rate drop is in, say, 3 months' time, it's going to be controversial. There'll be some belly aching from Trump, I'll tell you that. Finally, we've heard a lot about trade wars with China over the last 2 administrations, but there is one front of the economic war where America isn't just beating China, they're smashing China. We're talking microchips and the semiconductors used in them. Microchips are used in phones, in cars, in microwaves, and most importantly, in weaponry. And their semiconductors are very challenging to manufacture, which is why very few companies around the world do. It's also why in 2022, the Biden administration barred US companies from selling the most advanced chips and chip-making equipment to China, effectively isolating the Chinese tech sector. But even more so, the Biden administration also convinced Japan and the Netherlands, the 2 other leading sources of semiconductor machinery, to introduce their own bans. So what's been the result of this? China's most advanced maker of semiconductor equipment is capable of manufacturing 28 nanometer chips. whereas the industry's cutting-edge standard is at 2 nanometer chips. I'm sure this is all very confusing. Nanometers are extremely small. But the key here is the smaller the chip, the more you can cram in there, the more powerful that microchip technology is. And so, roughly speaking, the 2 nanometer chips of America, the tiny chips, are about 2 generations ahead of China's bigger 28 nanometer chips. But what does this all mean in reality? I spoke earlier to Jimmy Goodrich, an expert on technology and national security at global policy think tank, the RAND Corporation. Jimmy Goodrich, welcome to the Fireside Chat.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Now, when we're talking about the difference between 28 nanometer and 2 nanometer chips, what difference does that make in practical terms? 28 nanometers still seems pretty small.
So, right, it is. All chips are amazing and small. However, they have different applications. And if you think about the scale of them, they're exponentially smaller. So your 28 nanometer chips are going to be used for electric vehicles, medical devices, industrial goods. Whereas 2 nanometer chips are going to be those that are the smallest, most powerful, that are in AI, that are in supercomputers. Put that in perspective, a modern AI chip from NVIDIA has over 100 billion transistors at 3 nanometers. Each of those transistors is around 20 to 30,000 times smaller than the human hair. So 28 nanometers is about several thousand times smaller than human hair, but when you get to 3 nanometer, it's just even that much smaller. Just packing in those transistors, each of them computing all sorts of different data. So the reality is that all semiconductors are important, whether it's 3 nanometer, 28 nanometer, they come in all different shapes and sizes, but each of them is important in its own right, whether it's for your toaster or your temperature sensor in your car, which is going to be those older 28 nanometer chips, or those 3 nanometer chips used for AI. They're all important.
So you're saying that the 28 nanometer chips can't be used for AI applications?
Today, they are not. However, in the future, we might see more devices at the edge. Think AI in your Alexa, AI in your garage door opener, and they're going to be using some of that older technology. So, the reality is you can have AI everywhere. It just, the smaller the chip, the more powerful the AI you're going to have.
Given that China seems hell-bent on bridging this gap in chip technology, why haven't they been able to do so far?
Well, there's a couple of factors. One, this is really hard technology. It's at the frontier of engineering, science, physics. In fact, there's only a few countries in the world today that have figured out how to produce the most advanced chips: the United States, Taiwan, and South Korea. Others have tried, like Japan, parts of Europe, and they've fallen behind. In fact, the United States today is even struggling to keep up with, say, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, TSMC, and Taiwan. So this isn't a piece of cake. This is very hard technology. In fact, at 2 nanometers and beyond, you're really talking about some of the most advanced technology that humanity has ever built. So this is hard stuff. On top of that, the United States has imposed a series of fairly draconian export controls designed at taking away the critical inputs that China would need to build those things, from the machinery to some of the materials, software, and IP. So they're throwing sand in the gears to slow China's progress down. And if you think about, for example, the most advanced machinery used for semiconductor production, which is the extreme ultraviolet lithography coming from the Netherlands, ASML, the company, Advanced Semiconductor Machinery there in the Netherlands, they're blasting extreme ultraviolet lasers through dozens of some of the most fine optics from Zeiss in Germany at 10,000 drops of tungsten per second, blasting into plasma that allows them to etch those features onto the semiconductor wafer at the nanoscale level. Really, it's just amazing feat of humanity. They've been able to build these huge machines. They're the size of an 18-wheeler type of trucks, costing hundreds of millions of dollars. So this isn't something that China can just recreate overnight. It's a formidable country with smart engineers, a lot of resources. But at the end of the day, this is really hard stuff. It's almost like magic.
Now, Jimmy, we've been hearing about Chinese corporate espionage for decades. How is it that they haven't been able to steal the secrets of creating these industries? Or is the key factor here depriving them of the inputs?
They very well may already have many of the IP, the blueprints, the technology from various different sources. However, that's not enough. That's only one piece of the puzzle. Back to the example of those EUV machines that ASML makes, they have over 10,000 different parts. They have 20,000 plus employees working on the research development, over 1,000 different suppliers all around the world that really make this happen together. There's no single person in ASML or even worldwide that knows how the entire machine works. There's a lot of, we say, know-how and knowledge that's in that machine that's not written down, but rather in the brains of thousands of different engineers that they've accumulated over years. And so you just can't replicate that. And of course, they'd have to force all those people to leave the Netherlands and go to Beijing to help them develop these things. And that's just not happening. So they have to start from scratch. They have to learn the way that these companies did, which is on their own, innovating the hard way. It takes time. But while China isn't throwing a lot of resources at trying to close the gap on their own with these indigenous technologies, the rest of the world's not standing still. In fact, NVIDIA, ASML, Intel, AMD, they're continuing to accelerate forward. So if you think about it, China is trying to race to close a gap at a certain point in time, but the rest of the world keeps on moving forward. So no matter how hard they run, because everyone else has a head start, it's going to be incredibly challenging for them to catch up.
Now, they say that China is 2 generations behind America in microchip production, but Biden only started these hardcore restrictions back in 2022. So why are they that far behind?
Well, actually, it was the previous administration, the Trump administration, that really started hammering China on the semiconductor front. They first placed a number of China's leading companies, ZTE Microelectronics, Huawei, on their blacklist. They then actually took the first step to restrict that precision machinery from the Netherlands to China by reaching out to the Dutch Prime Minister, imploring them to not allow these to be exported to China. And then they placed China's largest chip manufacturer, SMIC, on their blacklist as well. So actually, it's been continuity between both Biden and Trump. This is the one thing that they would both agree on, that not allowing China to have the most advanced chips is something they both believe is a national security priority.
Jimmy, if China was to take over Taiwan, is that the end of their high technology problem right there? Or do they still have the getting the supply from Netherlands and Japan problem?
We all know that China has ambitions to reunite with Taiwan. And if that were to happen, Taiwan is an island. They rely on inputs from all around the world, whether it's the precision machinery we've talked about, the gases and the materials. So they would have to import those from Japan, the United States, and other countries. And it's a big question mark that, if there was a crisis and Taiwan and China were somehow integrated, would the West continue to provide those critical inputs? It's a big question mark. And if they didn't, even China wouldn't be able to continue to operate those chip factories on the island. So, there's been, I think, some commentary that the U.S. should, target Taiwan's fabs in some sort of emergency, even blow them up. Frankly, none of that is necessary because both the U.S., Japan, and Europe control all the inputs that are necessary for the operation of those factories.
Jimmy Goodrich, thanks for joining the Fireside Chat.
Thank you. Pleasure to talk with you this evening.
Now, before we go, Apollo 8 astronaut Bill Anders died this week at the grand old age of 90. He was killed when he was flying solo a vintage plane. It crashed into the waters off Jones Island in Washington State. You might not remember Bill Anders by name, but you've almost certainly seen this photo that he took on Christmas Eve 1968. It is one of the most famous images ever created. As Anders orbited the moon, it's called Earthrise, and it was the first colour photo of Earth from space. And it changed the way that many viewed our planet, its beauty and its fragility as well. And that's it from the Fireside Chat. We'll see you Wednesday night for Planet America on ABC TV at 10 p.m. and from 9 on iView, YouTube and Facebook.
And there's more still on the Pep Podcast in all the usual pod places. I'll see you there. Bye-bye.